as well as, sorry, he is the director of the Child Guidance Clinic. So we thought that this was an important topic, seeing that mental health problems has been on the rise, exacerbated by the pandemic, and we hope that you find this beneficial, inshallah.
Shukran Wasila for the introduction. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Many thanks to the MSA for inviting me to give this talk on Islam and mental health. It's a neglected and I'd say misunderstood topic in our community. So let me begin by just mentioning a couple of statistics. I think that's a good sort of segue into the topic of mental health in South Africa more broadly. 1 in 3 South Africans can expect to be diagnosed with a mental disorder at some point in their lives. And 1 in 10 will be diagnosed with either an anxiety disorder, a depressive disorder, or a substance use disorder. Those 3 categories are known as the common mental disorders. In the last 12 months, 1 in 6 South Africans has been suffering from some or other mental disorder. For those of you who are looking at this maybe in terms of rands and cents, you can imagine that the cost of mental illness to the South African economy is substantial. And we're talking in the range of tens of billions of rands per annum due to lost productivity, work hours, and all the rest. Of course, that sits alongside the soft costs of the anguish and the agony that people who suffer from mental disorders experience every day of their lives. Tom Insel is a very interesting and very prominent neuroscientist based in the United States. And I would just like to read a quote to you on what he said about the treatment of mental illness. Quote unquote, "While I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness." End quote. That is staggering. And a staggering admission, never mind the numbers, from one of the leading neuroscientists in the world. Because the bottom line is this: we can't definitively say what causes mental illness. There are no biological markers, there are no genetic markers, there are no blood tests, brain scans. There's no way to tell. You can see different parts of the brain flashing, if you will. You can make inferences around associations, but you can say desperately little about causation. And of course, one of the things you will know in a research-intensive university like UCT is that there's a big difference between causation and association. So in the world of neuroscience and biological psychiatry, we really can't say anything with much confidence about what causes mental illness. In my world of psychology, we also tend to hypothesize really about internal causes that are located within the individual. So for example, if you're coming at it from a psychoanalytic perspective, you might talk about unconscious conflicts that the individual has. And those unconscious conflicts are resulting in the person becoming symptomatic and displaying signs and symptoms of mental illness. If you're coming at it from a cognitive behavioral perspective, you might say something along the lines of the patient having, again, internal core beliefs, fundamental beliefs about themselves, about other people, about how the world operates, that are causing them mental distress. But again, the explanations are at the level of the individual. A classic book that was written in the in the early 90s. It's called We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Getting Worse. It's a book that I still use and that I still reference because I think it expresses the problem facing us very succinctly. That despite all the tens of billions of dollars that we pour into mental health research and treatment, as you heard from Tom Insel, we're still not moving the needle. So what's going on? Why is it that increasingly psychologists and psychiatrists are speaking less about cure than about care? What's going on? Now, within our community, the Muslim community, I'm sure you've heard it said many times that what causes mental illness is a lack of iman, a lack of proper belief. Now, I would respond to this in two ways. And the first is that I think we have to be careful of equating mental health with spiritual health. I think there are overlaps, but conceptually and practically, there are considerable differences. When I think of spiritual health, for example, I think about the cultivation of virtue. So I think about virtues like sabr, patience, tawakkul, trust, taqwa, piety, and so on. That's what I think of when I think of spiritual health. When I think of mental health, though, I'm thinking about something quite different. So the categories, the terms of reference are fundamentally different when you're talking about mental health on the one hand or spiritual health on the other. So that's the first thing I would say to people who claim that a lack of iman is a cause for mental illness. The second thing is just that it doesn't square with my own experience as a practicing clinical psychologist of almost 20 years. I see many Muslim patients, and they span the spectrum when it comes to iman, if you will. At least outwardly, some patients are extremely observant. Others are less observant. Some have doubts. And some have renounced the faith completely. And yet they all suffer. They all agonize in their own unique ways. And this again leads me to think that it's not a lack of iman, a lack of faith or belief that causes mental distress. We need to be thinking about something quite different, I would suggest. What then? If it's not brain scans, if it's not blood tests, if it's not unconscious conflicts, if it's not a lack of iman, what is it? What then causes mental illness? Now, it's extremely difficult to talk about what causes mental illness if we don't have a working definition of what mental illness is. So what is mental illness? And again, it's an extremely difficult concept to pin down. Again, if I think about my own experience as a psychotherapist, I tend to think of mental illness more as what the radical psychiatrist or the libertarian psychiatrist Thomas Sass called problems in living. I find that less stigmatizing, and of course everybody has them. Everybody has problems in living. What kinds of problems in living? Well, again, based on the patients that I've seen down the years, I typically find, not always, but typically, I find that these problems of living can be reduced to one of two things, if not both. The one has to do with love, and the other has to do with work. And by love, I'm not simply referring to romantic relationships, marriages, and so on. I'm talking about relationships in the broad sense. In other words, connections we have to the important attachment figures in our lives. They could be friends, they could be a romantic partner, they could be our parents, they could be our siblings, our aunts, uncles. It comes, one of the factors that almost always presents is some problem around relating to attachment figures. The other factor I mentioned is work. And again, work involves relationships. Work involves relationships, and of course work also includes studies, right? At this point, you're studying, but in a sense it's simply a precursor to the world of work, isn't it? It's work, but of the studying kind. So here as well, I find that patients who are struggling with problems in living can also have difficulties in how they relate to the task of work. Whether they're feeling ineffective, whether they're failing, whether they find it unfulfilling, boring, dehumanizing, whether they can't get on with their work colleagues, there are problems in the world of work. So love and work. And Sigmund Freud, one of the things he said was simply this: love and work, work and love, what else is there really? Now, of course, as Muslims, we believe that there's a lot more. Right? There's a lot more beyond work and love. But surely, those are two major domains in our lives. And I find that when people come to see me, often it's because they are struggling in one, if not both, of those domains. Now, this brings me to the idea of what Frantz Fanon once called sociogeny. Right? The idea that a dysfunctional world can generate psychological suffering. Sure, you may have a genetic predisposition based on your family history, but a sick society, if you will, can make people suffer internally. I remember one famous line from Malcolm X's autobiography, as told to Alex Haley. He was writing about, he was speaking about his mother's admission to a mental asylum. And he said more or less, and I'm paraphrasing here, I have no sympathy for a society that would crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. Malcolm X. So Frantz Fanon's idea of sociogeny, I think, is the direction we should be looking at when it comes to mental suffering, problems in living. That a sick society can cause people untold levels of suffering. The world we live in today, the modern world, does it generate mental illness? Is modernity itself pathogenic? I.e., our uncritical embrace of economic development, industrialization, and science and technology. What is the trade-off when it comes to our internal worlds? You know already as students just how all-consuming your studies are. And you probably know just from watching the people in your lives, perhaps your parents who are in the world of work, just how all-consuming it will continue to be. That people are either at work, recovering from work, or getting ready to go to work. That's if they happen to be fortunate enough to have employment in a country like ours. The nature of modern work is all-encompassing. There's a wonderful movie that Charlie Chaplin's in called Modern Times, made in the 1930s. A really prophetic, if you will, movie about the dangers of industrialization and its impact on people's mental health, where literally Charlie Chaplin goes crazy in the end and ends up in a mental asylum. He observed, in other words, how the automation of working life was driving people mad, literally. Unable to experience the joys of creative activity Most modern workers now function as robots in a world run increasingly by machines. We are getting owned by the very things that we create. Unlike pre-industrial times, human beings no longer produce goods for their own use. Instead, they manufacture products and provide services for faceless consumers living thousands of miles away. Workers no longer oversee production processes from start to finish, having been left instead with highly specialized tasks that render the activity of work largely meaningless. And as for their spouses, they too live lives of quiet desperation. They too are hamsters on corporate wheels. I'm talking now about the family. If they haven't already succumbed to the drudgery of domestic life. Meanwhile, the attention-hungry children, and perhaps some of you experienced this growing up, start harassing the parents who, now thoroughly anesthetized to life itself, are too tired to care, having settled for watching series or trawling through multiple social media platforms, in short, doing anything to induce artificial feeling states in order to stop the numbness that has long since taken over. Alienated from their work and from each other, the parents no longer recognize one another. Some, in fact, can barely tolerate the sight of each other as they begin to raise their children on a steady diet of computer screens, TV screens, tablet screens, mobile screens. In other words, a mediated reality rather than reality itself. Socializing their children inadvertently into becoming the next generation of mindless cogs in a massive corporate machinery. Thoroughly atomized and isolated, parents and children become strangers to one another like ships passing in the night. I think the key word in that passage is from a talk I gave a little while ago. The key word for me is atomization. The increasingly fractured and fragmented lives that we lead from one 10-second soundbite to the next. Is Islam the solution? One often hears that said, that if you can just be a proper Muslim, then all your troubles will go away. And I'd say to an extent, yes. And I say to an extent because, as I understand it, Islam is fundamentally a social faith, not a private one. If you just think about the 5 pillars, Shahada, fasting, Salah, Zakah, Hajj, they're all social. Think about the Shahada, for example. The Shahada doesn't count unless you say it out loud. It cannot simply be in the heart. It has to be said out loud. Because when you say it out loud, you get recognized as a co-religionist. And so therefore, the benefits that accrue to members of the faith now fall to you. The Shahada must be stated out loud. If you think about Salah as well, we are encouraged to do so in Jama'ah, right? As a social activity. If one thinks about Zakat, granted it's given in private, usually, or I suppose it depends on the person, but again, it's an act of social responsibility. Fasting and Hajj, both of these pillars are social activities. I can't rock up in Makkah now and go and perform my Hajj. Right? I can't start fasting a month of Ramadan tomorrow. There's a set time where we all have to do it. Islam is a fundamentally social religion, whichever of those 5 pillars you look at. And what I mean to say, therefore, is that Islam prioritizes and values community, relationships, whereas modernity, unfortunately, to date, is taking us in the opposite direction, because it essentially has led to the fragmentation, the atomization, the alienation of social life. But I said also that I think that Islam is a solution to an extent. I don't think that as Muslims we are special psychological types, that we are fundamentally psychologically different to people who don't share our beliefs. And remember earlier my distinction between mental health on the one hand and spiritual health on the other. I mean, I concede that there are overlaps, but it's, I think, foolhardy to equate the one with the other. There's also something to be said about the very nature of life, which is that it involves suffering. It must. Surah Al-Balad, there's an ayah in Surah Al-Balad where Allah says that that we have truly created humankind in hardship. Our mothers bear us in hardship. They give birth to us in hardship. When the little teeth sprout out of our gums, we cry out because we're experiencing hardship. And it doesn't get any easier. There's hardship encoded into the journey of life at every single stage. If one looks at the commentaries of that verse in Surah Al-Balad, it's clear what the commentators say, that to live is to suffer. It's an existential truth. We see it in the example of the prophets, alayhimus salam. There's a wonderfully descriptive ayah in Surah Yusuf, where the emotional state of Nabi Yaqub alayhi salam is described, where he turns away from his sons and he laments what he thinks is the loss of his son Yusuf alayhi salam. And he suppresses his grief. He suppresses his grief and his eyes turn white. In other words, he goes blind from grief. And this is a prophet alayhi salam. We know from that the example of Nabi Musa as well, where he experienced considerable anxiety at the thought of having to speak publicly in the court of Fir'aun. And there we have that very famous series of ayat in Surah Taha. رَبِّ اشْرَحْ لِي صَدْرِي وَيَسِّرْ لِي أَمْرِي وَاحْلُلْ عُقْدَةً مِّن لِسَانِي يَفْقَهُوا قَوْلِي. In the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, we know from the seerah that there was one year in particular in which sadness was a dominant experience for him. And it's called Amul Huzn, right? The year of sadness, when he lost his beloved wife. I think he lost his uncle. That was a year of sadness. Even the prophets, alayhimus salam, are not beyond experiencing psychological suffering. To live is to suffer. There's also a wonderful passage in Imam al-Ghazali's book, Al-Iqtisad fil-I'tiqad. It's a wonderful title, Moderation in Belief. It's so necessary in today's day and age. And I just want to read a short quote from this kitab. And he has this to say about earthly existence. There would be benefit for man had he been created in paradise without pain or grief. But as for our present existence, here's the startling part. As for our present existence, all intelligent men desire non-being. Anyone with intelligence would rather not be here. Would rather check out from the planet. Imam al-Ghazali. One says, would that I were oblivious and forgotten. Another says, would that I were nothing. And still another, would that I were this piece of straw that is swept from the earth. Now, of course, Imam Ghazali is not advocating self-annihilation or anything of the sort. But he is, again, homing in on that unavoidable truth that to live is to suffer. And one could almost say, one could almost extrapolate from that anyone who has not, and I know this sounds a little bit extreme, but anyone who has not at some point in their lives experienced anxiety or depression, then that person hasn't thought very deeply about life at all. Because if we truly understand that this is not where we come from, this earth, and it's not going to be our final destination, if we recognize this fundamental cleavage between where we are and from where it is that we originate, isn't that enough to induce anxiety and depression? I think it puts a completely different spin, actually, on the experience of sorrow, fear, sadness, anxiety. That in some sense, to go back to Imam al-Ghazali, it is the malady, it is the condition of all intelligent people. But let's spend a little bit more time talking about anxiety and depression. Those are, after all, two of the three most common mental disorders, not just in South Africa, but anywhere in the world. There's, again, a famous ayah in the Quran, you're all familiar with it, that mentions anxiety and depression in juxtaposition to one another, or in combination rather. And this ayah occurs at least 15 times in the Quran. لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. No fear is upon them, nor shall they grieve. Sadness and fear, depression and anxiety. It's mentioned in combination in the Quran at least 15 times. Clearly it's something to meditate upon. Now, if one thinks about depression, and particularly, if you will, a psychoanalytic understanding of depression, then it's really about loss. People who are depressed have lost something in life. Whether it's a person, could be a job, could be anything, could be a dream. They've lost something. In other words, depression, and I know I'm freestyling a bit here, depression is really about our relationship to the past. Whereas anxiety is about the future. Anxiety is about what's to come. So of course, if you want a rule of thumb about how to stay healthy, then you want to stay focused on the present. Right? Try not to become too preoccupied with what's happened or what hasn't yet happened. Try to focus on what's in the now. Right? Stay in the present. But the problem is we are time-bound creatures. There are parts of our brain that are specifically for planning, that are oriented towards the future. There are parts of our brain that are all about memory, that are all about what's already happened. We are time-bound, not just space-bound, we are time-bound. We can't avoid the experience of the past and the experience and the fantasy about the future. We can't avoid those things. It's programmed into us on a biological level. And so again, it ties in with that fundamental Quranic concept that to live is to suffer. Can't get away from it. And it's just a matter of degree. Maybe it's not full-blown anxiety and depression. It could just be fear and sorrow. Apprehension and sadness. Just on a spectrum. But it's there. And there's no way to get around it. So, coming back to that ayah that repeats itself 15 times, لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. The people who will not fear and the people who will not grieve. Who are those people? Now, there are again ayat which explains who those people are. For example, they spend of their wealth, they are obedient to Allah, and so on. But what I really want to say is this. If one looks at the tafsir of that ayah, لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون, it refers to the afterlife. And that's crucial. It refers to the afterlife. It's the definition of salvation in the next life. In other words, we can strive for it in this life, a life free of worry and a life free of sadness. But really, that is something to be experienced in the next world. It's not something that we can have in this life for the reasons that I've just explained. We can't have it. And so, of course, surely salvation should be something really wonderful. And wouldn't that be something wonderful? Where you no longer have to suffer the disadvantages of being time-bound. لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. So, where does psychotherapy or counseling fit into all of this? Well, one of the cornerstones of, several of the cornerstones of a helping relationship is that they're warm, they're empathic, they're non-judgmental. And as I understand it, counseling and psychotherapy provides a space in which people can think through these problems of living, which very, very frequently are constellated around either love, on the one hand, in the broad sense, or work, on the other. Psychotherapy, counseling can have different goals, depending on who it is that your therapist is. It can assist you to lead relatively satisfying and productive lives. It can help you feel more alive, more real, less deadened. And for some, psychotherapy is all about just tolerating pain, being able to live with it. So psychotherapy and counseling has different goals, different possibilities, depending on who it is that is counseling you. But I also want to say that the decision to see a psychologist or to see a counselor is a very serious one that any person that a person can make. And I say serious because it involves an enormous amount of courage to, quote unquote, trust the process of psychotherapy. For many, the idea of talking to someone about what's ailing you is terrifying. Not everybody would welcome such an opportunity. And I know this from the responses I get when people ask me what I do for a living. If I say I'm a psychologist, some people will then start telling me their life stories. And other people will run for the hills. So, at least for those people, the prospect of entering into a therapeutic space is a horrifying prospect. But it's ultimately a very courageous decision, in my view. And I would also say that a good deal of what I've said to you tonight isn't necessarily from textbooks. It's actually things I've learned from my patients over almost 2 decades now. There's a Chinese aphorism. I always like the Chinese aphorisms. It's like they've got a different take on wisdom. And maybe you've heard it. They have this saying, he who asks a question is a fool for a moment, but whoever doesn't ask the question is a fool for a lifetime. So the decision to go into therapy, into counseling, is a very serious one. And I take my hat off. I salute the bravery and the courage of patients that are willing to find out the truth about themselves. You'll see behind me a list of resources. I was asked just to make some of these known to you, so perhaps I should just talk through them. Student Wellness Services obviously has a counseling hub. You can call during office hours, that number, if you need to see a psychologist, or you can make online bookings as well. The online booking system, what will happen is you will have one online assessment, which will be free, just so that the person you're seeing can make an assessment of any the seriousness of the problem and what referrals might need to be made. And you can then have up to 8 sessions thereafter, 100 Rand per session, which is very cheap, I must say, because psychotherapy, for those of you that know, is extremely expensive. If you see someone in private practice now, you can expect to pay 1,100 Rand for one session, for a 50-minute session. There are also 24/7 telephonic counseling lines, free from a telecom line. You can also just SMS that number 31393, and then a counsellor will call you back. There are support groups that Student Wellness also offers. Support groups around exam stress, mindfulness, postgrad support, social isolation, and Kulumani Madoda Men Let's Talk. I'm based at the UCT Child Guidance Clinic. You can also be seen there. There's a little bit of a waiting time, and you would be seen by one of the master's clinical trainees, and they all work under clinical supervision. And then there's also a very useful web resource, therapyroute.com. Those of you who are on medical aid, that's obviously to your benefit. Student Wellness, I also know, has a list of psychologists that offer psychotherapy at reduced rates. But the bottom line is that as far as Student Wellness is concerned, they won't turn anyone away who can't afford to pay for psychotherapy. Of course, in an ideal world, you don't want to wait till the pawpaw hits the fan, as it were, right? You want to do something in terms of promoting your mental health. And again, there are a couple of things that I think are pretty crucial, and that one can lose sight of in the busy lives that you lead as students. 3 things for me that are crucial, and you probably know this already, but I'll say it again: diet, exercise, and sleep. Sleep in particular, sleep hygiene, is a major factor when it comes to mental illness. Sleep hygiene, i.e. having a routine, right? Not checking your phone 10 seconds before you turn out the lights. Having a routine where you settle down, right? You slowly detox from all the social media platforms, right? Going to sleep at the same time each night, not 10 o'clock tonight and then 3 o'clock tomorrow morning, the next night. Having a consistent routine is important when it comes to sleep. Exercise, the literature is clear that exercise is a very effective form of alleviating, especially forms of anxiety. Diet, again, is crucial. Beware the 2 killers of salt and sugar. You would be amazed at how much better you can feel about yourself just by doing these things right: diet, exercise, and sleep. And then, of course, the one thing that I can't neglect, given the contents of tonight's talk, is relationships. Look after your relationships. Those are the things that nourish people. We are inherently social beings. And that's why I suppose our faith stresses the sociality of human beings, because each of the 5 pillars is a social pillar. So look after the relationships in your lives, whether it's with your siblings, whether it's with your friends, with your parents, with your partners. Look after those. Okay, I think I've been droning on for long enough, so I'll leave it there. Questions and answers? Well, hopefully answers.
That guy stand up before me, I think.
Okay.
There's a lot of stigma I find with mental illness, and there's this incredible denial of mental illness. How does one engage with that and try to move past that through, how do I put this up, is through one's faith?
Mm-hmm. It's a huge question that's not easily answered. The first thing I would say is that mental health literacy is shockingly low, and not just in the Muslim community, but across the country. And stigma is a major problem. So mental health literacy is just really low, unfortunately. I think also that there still is a lot of confusion within the Muslim community around mental health on the one hand and spiritual health on the other. The two get conflated all the time, and that produces, I think, real problems around stigma of people that are experiencing real psychological distress. So I would say it's an education issue in the sense that it's a mental health literacy issue. But I also think that related to that, it then falls on influential figures in the community to impart the right kind of advice to the community at large about mental health and mental illness. And unfortunately, I don't think that happens enough. It's also understandable. I mean, if I think of our clerical class, our imams and our shuyukhs, and please, this is not a criticism. I do think that many of them just don't know about what's involved when it comes to mental health and mental health services and so on. And that, to some extent, is just because it's not, I don't think that the issue of mental health is something that is that is really a feature in religious seminaries. So the people of influence in our community, I think, are the ones that can really play an important part in lessening the stigma around mental illness by giving accurate information around what it actually is. I mean, I would also say this, that I think that as the Muslim community becomes more and more educated, of course, if one thinks about apartheid, the history of apartheid and colonialism, I think there are large sectors of the Muslim community that are not going to come sit in a UCT lecture theatre to hear a lecture on mental health. And I think that as community upliftment proceeds, as people become more educated and become more aware of the, I suppose, the mental health challenges that come with living busy modern lives, then the problem will also lessen to some extent. That relates to, I suppose, another issue, which is that psychology is a modern discipline. And when I talk about modern, folks, I don't mean it in a pejorative sense. I don't mean, there's modern and then there's primitive. I mean modern as in a valorization of science and technology and industrialization. Right? Psychology is a modern discipline in that sense. It's associated with modernity. And I think that as the Muslim community modernizes, and again, I'm not meaning that in a pejorative sense or in a value-laden sense. I'm simply saying as the Muslim community modernizes in terms of its relationship to science, technology, education, and so on, that will also alleviate this problem of stigma to some extent.
Would you recommend going to Muslim therapist because, in terms of context, especially with religion and going through issues that might be specific to religion, would a non-Muslim therapist be able to help you with that, seeing as they don't have the knowledge to support the context?
It's a great question. As Muslims, should you be seeing Muslim therapists because they have a cultural frame of reference that a religio-cultural frame of reference that non-Muslim therapists might not have? I think it depends on the patient, and I think it depends on what it is that they're struggling with. Some patients would prefer not to see Muslim patients now. Would prefer not to see Muslim therapists. They actually want to talk to someone who doesn't bring a religious frame of reference to the therapeutic encounter. Whereas other Muslims would say, no, you're not going to understand me. You don't understand the pressures that come to bear on me as a young Muslim growing up in Cape Town. Therefore, I have to see a Muslim psychologist. So I think it depends on the patient. And then it depends also, as I said, on what it is that the patient is struggling with. I mean, for example, if it's around family issues, right? Some Muslim patients would say, I'd rather see a Muslim therapist because they understand how Muslim family life works. But again, you could get other Muslim patients to say, no, I don't want to see a Muslim. I want to see someone who has a different understanding about what family life should look like. So from my side, I wouldn't be prescriptive, actually. Yeah. I would say it depends on the patient and what it is that they're struggling with.
We have a question from our Instagram. Are antidepressants for life?
Or antidepressants for life? Again, it depends on the patient, depends on the diagnosis. It's not a question that has a blanket answer. But what I would say is that no, it's not necessarily for life. What some patients do is, what happens to some patients is they have a depressive episode that can last for a few months. And then they might, for example, go on a course of antidepressants for, say, 6 months or a year or 2 years. They slowly wean themselves off. They realize that they're not depressed anymore, and then they carry on with life. There's no need to stay on the antidepressants. Other patients, the situation might be different. In the case of a severe and a persistent depression, then you might be looking at a much longer period of being on antidepressants. I should also say that antidepressant medication over the decades has really advanced leaps and bounds in terms of side effect profiles. Of course, one cannot say that there's a perfect antidepressant for everyone, because we all respond to medication differently, but I would say that that if you're having an adverse reaction to given a prescribed antidepressant, that is not the end of the road, that there are many other options, and you simply go back to your GP or your psychiatrist to get another prescription.
You mentioned the whole thing of like anxiety being caused like fear of the future and sadness of the past.
Yeah.
And what advice would you give like on these extreme, like when you're like more on the extreme sides of it and you struggle to be in the present? What practical things can one do to be in the present?
Yeah. So, for example, okay. So the question is, practically, what can you do if you are struggling to stay in the present? There are forms of therapy that would specialize in that kind of approach. Mindfulness, therapies that prioritize mindfulness, for example, are all about that. They are very much focused on I suppose, meditation in a way, and experiencing the present without judgment. So certainly something like a mindfulness type of therapy would be one way to go.
So my question is regarding to body language. So human beings have developed an art of camouflaging feelings toward or the way they're feeling, right? But there are certain key signs in terms of their body language on how they're feeling. So what are the certain signs one can see if someone is depressed or suffering from anxiety? What kind of body language would they represent to the audience? Even though they might camouflage it through a smile or through diverting from the topic. What are some of the telltale signs?
Okay, so again, these are not foolproof signs. So whatever I say now doesn't mean that if the person displays it that they are depressed or that they are anxious. But it's not uncommon with patients who are moderately to severely depressed to, for example, have a stooped posture. When you ask them a question, they can take a long time to respond. Right? It's sort of known as latency of response. So there's a long break between your question ending and the patient actually responding. Tearfulness, of course, but again, you don't know what it means. It might be a normal grieving process. It could just be tears of happiness. Who knows what it might mean? So I would be cautious of saying that particular, physical signs and symptoms mean the presence of anxiety or depression. Anxious patients, if one thinks diagnostically, for example, around panic attacks, the experience of panic attacks, then some of the symptoms would be things like sweating, heart palpitations, shaking, difficulty breathing, like shallow, rapid breathing. These would be some of the symptoms in a panic attack, for example. But again, if I go back to that example of the bad posture, the stooped posture, the person might just have really bad body, what do they call it? Low body tone or something, right? And so they walk in looking a bit pup. So they might just be, they might just need to work on their posture rather than being depressed. Yeah. At the back.
You mentioned today's type of working life in today's society, as well as optimization and context that can be conducive towards a problem with living. Are there any other examples of the way that today's society contributes towards those problems, or something that you want to expand on?
Sure. So the question is, what else might be contributing to problems in living? What worries me, and maybe I'm sort of sounding like a bit of a dinosaur here. What worries me is social media platforms. Relationships are increasingly digitally mediated. And people go for hits. They go for, chemical hits, as it were, posting on Instagram, or on Facebook, or on Twitter, and they regulate their emotional states through their access to social media platforms. So even though it sounds very old school, I do worry about the fact that we don't meet people for coffee anymore. I'm sure you've seen it in malls. Groups of friends, 4 or 5 people sitting in a coffee shop, right, around a table. No one's talking to each other. What are they doing? They're all on their phones, texting someone who is 50 kilometers away on the other side of the world. Right, so they've come together to socialize, but there's zero socialization happening. And I do worry if we are fundamentally social beings, and I do believe we are social animals, human beings, that we might actually be losing our ability to socialize. And if you lose your ability to initiate, build, nurture relationships, then I think an incredible alienation, actually, and it's estrangement from one's fundamental nature is taking place.
Another question from our Instagram. Are there scans of the brain that can be done to make the diagnostic confirmation about depression?
Are there brain scans that can be made to confirm a diagnosis of depression? So again, this comes back to one of the points I made earlier, that there aren't brain scans or blood tests or genetic markers when it comes to diagnosing mental illness. What you can do is draw conclusions around associations, that the brain of a depressed patient will show activity in certain areas and less activity in other areas. So you can talk about associations. But to say anything about causation is a very slippery slope indeed. And that's why if you look at the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorder, which is a bestseller for the American Psychiatric Association. If one looks at how depression, and not just depression, but most mental disorders are diagnosed, it's through signs and symptoms. In other words, take depression for example. Depressed mood, loss of motivation / enjoyment, loss of weight, or gain of weight, right? Increase or decrease in sleeping patterns, difficulty concentrating, right? It's all based on subjective self-report, what the patient is going to tell you. You can't stick the patient into some kind of machine and make a diagnosis. You've got to ask them questions that they then subjectively have to respond to. And I think it underscores really just how little we know about the causes of mental illness.
Last year we had a talk on anxiety in relation to exams, and the speaker quoted, I think his name is Thomas Ellis, Robert Ellis, is a American psychologist.
Ellis, yeah.
And basically his thesis was that it is not the circumstances that happen to you, but it's more our response to those circumstances that determines our experience of that event. I just wanted to know, in relation to what you mentioned about the sociogeny, that even if we can be in very terrible circumstances, which is the nature of the world, in many cases it may be out of our control, does the Islamic tradition provide for us tools or mechanisms that even though we might be in very horrible circumstances, we are able to overcome that using those spiritual mechanisms?
Yeah, so just the cultivation of virtues, I think, is one way to think about that question. In other words, developing tawakkul, one's sense of trust in Allah, sabr, right, patience. These are, and that's why I spoke earlier there is an overlap between spiritual health and mental health, but they are certainly not identical. So just from that perspective alone, just the cultivation of virtues is one way of dealing with dire personal circumstances. The Prophet ﷺ also said to us, one of the things about capitalist society is that there's a social ethic of comparison. One's always looking at the next person, and typically we look up. We look at the person who has more, and then we feel miserable. Right? The Prophet ﷺ was, it's incredible what he said, which is that you must focus on the people that have more. Let's focus on the people that have less, because that generates shukr, right? Gratitude. And of course gratitude is not just gratitude. If one gets into the meaning of kufr, for example, kufr it's not just about unbelief, it's about ingratitude. So the cultivation of virtues, I think there's a wonderful Islamic tradition there. Whether it's shukr, tawakkul, sabr, all of which can make life more bearable. Of course, people on the political left will take issue with that, right? Because, well, some anyway, because the argument will be made, yes, but if you just are cultivating these personal virtues, are you changing the world? And I think we've got to be careful of reducing that to a dichotomy where it's one or the other. Islam is a social faith, remember? Right? It's a social faith, which is to say that we are always concerned about the people around us. And that's why I was particularly struck by something the religious historian Karen Armstrong wrote in her biography of the Prophet ﷺ. She says, you know, Christianity is a religion of love, but Islam is a religion of social justice. And I think we mustn't lose sight of that. That, yes, we cultivate a spiritual life in terms of the virtues, right? But I think it's also important not to lose sight of the social ethic that is built into this faith in quite a fundamental way.
So I can deal with some people feel like the family is struggling with mental disorder or anxiety or something like that. But he's not willing to go for help. And you can't force him to go for help. That becomes frustrating. And you're like, how do you deal with like the guilt also of being frustrated about you?
Sure. Yeah. Very difficult question to answer. If someone doesn't want to pursue psychological treatment, then there's very little that you can do on that front. I mean, I suppose what one would do is make dua for that family member, which of course you would do whether or not they are seeking psychological treatment or not. But unfortunately, unless the patient unless this family member is a danger to themselves or to people around them, there isn't anything you can do. You know, sometimes what might help is a conversation just to hear what the concerns of that family member are. There are wonderful series about what happens in therapy. There's a great series called In Therapy, I believe, called In Therapy, 2 or 3 seasons of it. It's probably it could be about 10, 15 years old, but it's masterfully done. In Therapy with Gabriel Byrne. Gabriel Byrne is the therapist. So for those of you that perhaps don't know much about how therapy works, that's a wonderful series to sort of initiate yourselves into in therapy. So that's what I would say, just to hear like what are the concerns that this family member has, and that might be a gentle way, a quite entertaining way actually, to sort of allay their fears, just by watching therapy in action. I think it's very well done. There are lots of therapies where it raises my eyebrows. It's like, no, that's not how it goes down. But in therapy, I think is extremely well done. In treatment, it's called In Treatment. Sorry, In Treatment. Gabriel Byrne. Yeah.
So I'm doing religion as a major. This semester we're focusing on religion and psychology. And what we focused on initially of the readings was spiritual possession and metaphysics of religion. So not just the physical belief and practices, but also impact the spiritual world on man. And obviously there was Moera readings, etc., on spiritual possession. So I just to know your feedback as an academic and also as a Muslim. How do you draw the line between a spiritual possession or spiritual entity troubling insan, and then also an academic where this is actually a mental illness?
Yeah. So the dilemma there is whether it's possession or whether it's psychosis, essentially. Or for that matter, a dissociative disorder, actually. I mean, one could throw that into the mix as well. So what I would say first is that I plead ignorance when it comes to spirit possession. I would not feel comfortable making that call. So if a patient were to present in that kind of way, claiming to be possessed by spirits, I would not want to treat that patient in the absence of consulting with other relevant practitioners. Probably a psychiatrist, and probably I don't know what the term is in the community. Tukum, is that the right word? Araki, yes. Someone who specializes and would recognize a genuine possession from actually a psychotic illness. So I wouldn't feel comfortable making that call myself. I would definitely consult.
Where would you go the line as an academic to say, I've treated this patient, I've spoken, I've had a conversation, I've given medicines, and there's still no benefit coming out of this, and what would you diagnose that to?
Are you talking now in the context of possession?
No, in order to understand, decipher, would it come across your mind as, okay, what should I do now? Is it something I need to give to someone from another, a chef or someone from a spiritual institution? Or how would you deal with something?
So I wouldn't treat that person at all. I would have an initial consultation and I would immediately consult, because if I were to initiate treatment, what would I be treating?
No. My question was that if someone, for example, they've come to you with some illness, and
Okay.
there's an academic or a psychologist has given them the medication, the treatment from your academic, right, and from your expertise. But after giving them everything from your expertise, and let's say over a period of time, hypothetically, and it's still not working, what would you do then? Would you refer them to someone from a holistic institution, or how would you treat that then if it's still not working after?
Okay, all right. So what happens in the case, in other words, of a treatment-resistant patient, in the sense that they're just not getting better? So again, consultation would be one part of the process. Supervision would be another part as well, and sometimes referral to another clinician might be indicated as well. Sometimes it does happen where the therapeutic process just gets stuck. And of course, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't dispense or prescribe medication. Sometimes the therapeutic process just gets stuck and the patient needs something else. And sometimes it's another psychologist. Sometimes it's as you suggest, a completely different approach to healing. Sometimes it's body work, for example. Increasingly, therapists are talking about the embodied nature of the mind, and that to an extent, therapy can be too discursive. It's too language-based. It's too cerebral, and that, for example, in the case of trauma, which can be encoded in the body, you need to get a body practitioner to also assist the patient. So different possibilities: consultation, supervision, referral to another therapist, or to a completely different practitioner.
Thank you.
I think we should probably just leave the questions there in case load shedding does go
Okay.
off. If that's okay.
If there's any more burning questions.
Okay. So I just want to say shukran so much for making some time to come speak to us. It was lovely just to hear the insights of the overlap, mental illness, mental health and spiritual health with its virtues. And I think we all really benefited from that, especially considering our world is inherently characterized by suffering. The importance of creating non-judgmental, empathetic, warm spaces in our work, in our love environments. I think it's always an important conversation to have. So shukran so much. This is just appreciation from the MSA. Hope to hear from you again.
Inshallah.
Oh, and then there are donuts, coffee, and tea for everyone. So you can just come down and enjoy each other.